Let me just jump in by introducing Madeline, who is a senior subject matter expert at the National Center for Accessible Media at WGBH, which is the public broadcaster in Boston. She specializes in ways to make digital and multimedia content accessible for users with disability, both directly through solutions like captions, talking software, and audio description, and also through improvements to infrastructure like standards efforts and accessibility metadata, which is what she'll be talking about today. And with that, Madeline, I will pass the reins over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here. We're going to talk today a bit about accessibility metadata. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about is in the context of ebooks, because Diagram and Benetech do so much fantastic work on making ebooks more accessible. But if you're not actually interested in ebooks, don't despair, because the meat of the presentation will be relevant for all kinds of digital and non-digital resources. But I'm going to start a little bit by talking about all of the standards that are involved in publishing an ebook. There are web standards like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines in HTML and ARIA. There's notes from the W3C on how to use digital publications, and there are special roles for digital publications. There's a standard called EPUB for Education, which takes the EPUB spec and adds some educational specifics to it. And there's a new EPUB accessibility document called Conformance and Discovery Requirements for EPUB Publications, which gives information on how to make EPUB books more accessible. And then finally, there's the schema.org and ONIX metadata. And all of these work together in the creation of a digital book. So you can think of a digital book as being kind of a layered structure. In the middle are the words or images or interactive widgets that make up the content itself. Those are arranged in a structure, and that's then wrapped in a book format, and it can be sold or offered from an online catalog or a website. And there are standards for each part of that process. So the words and so on in the middle are, should be structured in accessible HTML and use ARIA. And then they're arranged in their structure, chapters and sections and table of contents and so on, using the ARIA DPUB roles. Those then can be wrapped in a book format, such as EPUB, and in that case you would use the EPUB accessibility standard. And finally, when those are offered in an online catalog or a library system, that's when the schema.org or ONIX metadata come in. So today we'll be focusing on that outermost layer, the metadata. ONIX offers accessibility metadata that's used widely in the publishing industry. And they've got something called Code List 196, if you're trying to look for it. And it lists a lot of accessibility features. And they have numeric codes that you can put on your books for each one. Today we're going to be diving deeper into schema.org metadata, which is a metadata collaboration that is intended for use on the web and often by search engines. And the accessibility work at schema.org was kicked off by Benetech and the Diagram Center using a project called Accessibility Metadata, or A11ymetadata.org. And there's still information at that project site. We have some work in progress to try to harmonize between the ONIX accessibility list and the schema.org metadata, both to make sure that both of them are complete and to make it easier for anybody who's trying to convert between them. So the rest of this session will be talking about the schema.org accessibility metadata and what it's for, how you can use it, and what you might start doing now in different roles to help make it more useful. So what is schema.org accessibility metadata? It's a way to describe accessible resources so users can find the kinds of materials that are most useful to them. And this is sometimes called a one-fits-one approach. So more general web accessibility aims to have every resource be accessible to every person, but accessibility metadata takes the approach that sometimes a resource is very accessible to some people and maybe not even accessible to other people. And what's most important is that the users who can use it know that it's accessible to them and can find it. And also that users who can't use it know that it's not accessible to them before they, for example, download it or buy it or check it out of the library. So it's useful to know more before you use a resource, before you grab a resource, whether it is or isn't accessible to you. You can also use the metadata to warn users about hazards. So if there is flashing content that makes a resource inaccessible to people who have seizures that can be triggered by flashing. And there's also cases where people may find themselves become very ill if there are motion simulations, like a video of a roller coaster that could be just a little too realistic and make some people feel quite ill. So there's a way to warn people about hazards like that before they open up a resource and potentially have physical harm from it. The schema.org metadata is useful for publishers who are publishing books, and whether they're digital books or paper books, they can describe their accessibility features. They're also useful for libraries who are offering loaner copies of books and want to catalog those books and catalog the accessibility features of those books. And really they can be used by anybody who's publishing material on the web. It could be a school system that's collecting teacher educational materials and wants to label the accessibility of those materials as they're cataloged. And the content itself, as I mentioned, might not even be digital. You could, for example, use schema.org to mark up a library of books to indicate which ones are large print, which ones are Braille, and which ones are typical print. And so you could use the cataloging would all be digital, but you could use this to catalog non-digital materials if that was more useful to you. The accessibility metadata work has been proceeding at a terrific pace. This year we made some big improvements. So a couple of years ago we got the first sets of features approved, and those are 4 metadata properties. So metadata by definition is data about data. And what that means is that it's descriptive information about some other object. So the metadata is a way of describing a resource. So more typical metadata might be author, publication date, publisher name, and all those other kinds of pieces of data about a book or another resource. And the accessibility metadata that we have in place right now includes a way to describe accessibility features. What features does this resource have? Accessibility hazards, as I mentioned. Accessibility control interfaces. So is this a resource that you need to use a mouse in order to operate it, or can it be operated fully from the keyboard or from a touch gesture system? And then also accessibility APIs, especially for interactive activities or for applications more so than for books. You might want to say that this resource follows the macOS Accessibility API or the Windows Accessibility API so that users on those platforms will know that it's accessible for them if they're using assistive technology. And then we have 3 more new terms coming very soon. And so they're in the pending file at schema.org, which means that the next time Schema does a point release, they will be swept up in that release and made official. So they're available now on the website, and I'll tell you more about them in a little bit. So they're very nearly fully available. And these are a little more complicated, which is why they took longer. So one is access mode, which is the basic description of a resource. Does it have text in it? Does it have visuals? Does it have audio? And so on. Access mode sufficient is another way of looking at those access modes. I think I'll talk a bit more about that at the end when you've seen some of the examples. And then we've added a field called accessibility summary, which is for a human readable description. And this can be useful when there's kind of a nuance to the accessibility that isn't clear from the rest of the metadata. In addition to that, we're working on some expansion of the Braille terminology to make it easier to indicate for resources that are pre-formatted Braille files what kind of Braille is inside, since some users can read one kind and not another. So let's talk about some of what accessibility metadata is useful for. Here's an example that's available right now in the mainstream Google search tool. So in Google search right now, you might have stumbled on this, you can use the search tools to search for closed caption videos. And I think I'll show you what that looks like. Let me start sharing. Okay, so here is a Google search window. Is that big enough for anybody to read anything? I can make it bigger. That's probably better. Okay, so up here, so when you do a search, and here I've done a search on the word physics, you can then choose a video search, and then this little tools button over here, which opens and closes a panel of tools. And you can use this to search for shorter videos or longer videos, high quality or low quality. And then there's this button which in default mode only says all videos. It's not very clear at all. But if you choose it, it switches, the other choice in the menu is closed captions. And so here we see a list of videos that have closed captions and are about physics. But one thing you might notice about all of them is that they're all on YouTube. So Google's current closed caption video search tool only uses internal metadata from YouTube as far as we can tell. It's not using the publicly available schema metadata. And so it only finds videos that are inside YouTube. However, it's a handy little trick, and it definitely will find you videos with captions. And now, I come back to the slides. Does everybody now see slides again? Somebody will shout if it's not working.
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, thanks. So now I want to show you what you can do with the schema.org metadata, which is much more detailed than simply whether or not a video has captions. We can still search for captions. We can also search for alternative text or audio descriptions and a bunch of other features where they're marked up. So this uses something called the Google Custom Search Engine. And the problem with the Google Custom Search Engine is it's a little bit of a developer tool, essentially. Sometimes these links expire, so we're going to make this slideshow available afterwards. And you'll be able to click these links and try the tool out for yourself. But you might find when you go back to them in the future that these links don't work anymore, and that's because they expire, so I wanted to warn you. So let's go take a look at what Google Custom Search Engine can do. So switching back over to my browser, here is a Google Custom Search Engine for videos with captions. So if I type, for example, news in here, after the ads, because of course they're ads, we see a list of videos from organizations that have news in their name or news in the name of the title or something like that. And these videos all have schema.org metadata explaining that they have captions. So for example, if I click on a video, I'm actually clicking on a news article, of course, with the video in it. And the YouTube video comes up. Captions are already on. So there's a video. It's a YouTube video. It's been captioned. And I can find it. If I'm looking for captions on any particular videos on any particular topic, I can find ones that have been captioned using this custom search engine. And the reason this works is that the HTML of this little video player has an indicator in it. Now this came out of some terrific work that the Benetech folks did with the developer of a tool called WordPress YouTube Lite plugin. So it's a video plugin that's very popular on WordPress-based blogs. And the developer of that tool said, well, gee, I can see with internal metadata from YouTube when there's a caption video, and I can surface that caption feature with the schema.org metadata. So that's been tremendously successful. And you'll find in the custom search results, you'll see for any given topic dozens of different websites that are using the captioning data because they're using that tool that's doing it for them automatically. So the owner of the video had to create the captions, and hopefully they're good quality captions, but the tool is surfacing it. We can also do a similar search for, so here's the code for how you set up the custom search engine. I did want to show you this in case you're going to try to make your own. So Google offers this tool called Custom Search, and you can set up your own custom search engines. And you have to go down to the bottom where it says that you're restricting the page using schema.org types, and that's where you type in your schema.org code in order to tell it what you're searching for. So this right here says that I'm searching for video objects that have the term accessibility feature with the value captions. And that finds me videos that have caption. One word of warning to anyone who might try to make their own custom search engine. This paragraph right above the box says that you can use creative work and then you don't need to specifically say video or book or object. I do not find that to be true. I find that search engines built around the creative work term do not work at all. I need to file this as a bug with the Google team if I can figure out how to do that, because it's simply not true. If I want to find caption videos, I need to put video object. When I'm looking for books with image descriptions, I need to put book. Otherwise, the searches are not currently working properly. But it still works once you figure that trick out. So here's another search for videos with audio description. And there are actually quite a few of these out. Let's see, what's a good search term for this? How about science? You'll note that you do have to put in a search term as if you're doing a Google search as a person who wants to find information. You can't do a blank search and find every resource that has schema.org metadata, at least not that I've figured out how to do. So if I do a search on science, I get my science video results. And you might notice that all of these videos have the same, they're from the same place. They're from udescribe.org. udescribe is a project at Smith Kettlewell Institute, and they've created tools for adding audio description to videos and for playing it back. So they've currently got the largest source of public metadata encoded videos with audio description. So that's a good start. And finally, we have a search for books with alternative text or long description. So here in that schema.org code, I've set it up to search for, this is the one that doesn't work. This is the creative work one. Oh, maybe this is the one that is working. No, this is the one that doesn't work. So this one using creative work will not work properly. But if you did the same search with book instead of creative work, you would get this tool where you can search for books that have image descriptions in them, either short ones or long ones, because we have separate metadata for those. So for example, if I search on the word magic, I'll get a set of search results. And this includes books from all over the world. There are a number of different organizations that are creating books with image descriptions, and they're using the metadata. So you'll see Hathi Trust, which is the public domain book project, Open Libra, and then you'll see BNFA, which is the Library for the Blind in France. They've got a good collection. And then you'll also see Bookshare. So Bookshare has accessible books, as you probably know, and they're using schema.org metadata on their website. So if we click through to this book, we'll find out more about the book on the book's webpage. And that includes information about how many images it has and how many are described. So if you look in the public view of this book, it says that there are 35 essential images and all 35 are described. Not every book at Bookshare has descriptions yet, but it's a big collection and it's growing. And the metadata that's hidden behind this page is what's telling the custom search engine where to go to look for for books that have image descriptions. So those are some examples of what you can do right now with a Google custom search engine, and maybe someday with main Google search. Let's go back to the slides because I want to talk a little bit about even more powerful kinds of searches that are going to be possible. So these searches that you've seen so far only rely on the original schema.org features that I told you about. And mainly it's using accessibility feature, which is a way of saying that you have captions, you have audio descriptions, you have image descriptions, and so on, and a number of other features. I'll show you the list in a bit. But sometimes a resource is accessible for a particular person even without having any accessibility features. For example, if there's a document that's text and images, and I'm a person who has a hearing impairment, that document is fully accessible to me. It doesn't need captions because there isn't any audio in it. And this is the level of accessibility searching that is made possible by the new fields. So we don't yet have any working examples of searches that work this way because the metadata is just being approved right now. However, what I can tell you about is a previously available project called Teacher's Domain. Teacher's Domain was a digital library hosted at WGBH where I work. And we added accessibility metadata in a previous form before schema.org, but with the same information set. We added that accessibility metadata. And this enables much more sophisticated searches that take into account what features the object has to begin with, as well as what features a particular user needs to make something more accessible. So for example, here's a search result for a user who is deaf and has difficulty using a mouse. So the first item on the page, the first in the search results, oh, and by the way, the search term was DNA, because this was a library with a lot of science materials in it. So the first resource is called Journey into DNA. It's an interactive activity, and there's a flag there, a warning that mouse control is required. So that resource, you simply can't use it if you can't use a mouse. So that's good to know. A teacher who has students in their classroom who struggle to use a mouse might choose not to use this in her classroom, or a parent who's searching for something interesting might choose to skip that one if they know their child can't use it, and so on. The next video down is a DNA animation, and it's marked as accessible. It doesn't list any accessibility features. And that's okay because this turns out to be a silent video. So the second one and the fourth one both. In this collection, there's a number of silent videos that are meant for teachers to demonstrate a process while talking about it themselves. And because there's no audio, there's no need for captions. So that's accessible to the user with this profile. And then in the middle of this third item, DNA Databases, is an accessible video based on a NOVA episode. And it's got an accessibility feature of captions. So in this case, because there is audio, the captions are needed, and the combination makes this resource accessible for this user. So this Teacher's Domain site is no longer available, but luckily we captured a demo of it in action before it closed down. And it's available on the accessibilitymetadata.org website. And I've also got a link to it here on this slide. So if you want to go learn more about how Teacher's Domain used to work and about the potential for that access mode plus accessibility features metadata, you're welcome to visit the site and view that video. So I want to take a quick look at the actual metadata fields. I don't think I'll give every detail of every one of them because I'm not sure that's the best use of our time. I want to have some time for your questions and to talk a little bit more about where this is all going. So I'm just going to take a quick tour through the features themselves. So first of all, there's accessibility feature, which describes the content features of the resource, such as accessible media, alternatives, and supported enhancements for accessibility. This is so far the most popular of the terms. Schema.org automatically counts how many domains are using each term in their organizational schema. And accessibility features used at between 100 and 1,000 domains right now. So we'd like to see that go up, but it's definitely a good start. There are about 30 terms in the accessibility feature list. We added some more in most recent work. And we have a community process for adding new features. So for example, we'd like to add more features that are specifically useful to people with cognitive disabilities. And so we'll be working with the folks who are doing the research to figure out what those features should be. And we can then add them to the community vocabulary. Just as a highlight, some of the terms that are in this list of 30 are alternative text, braille, captions, and then for the ebook crowd, synchronized audio text so that you can specifically call out when you're providing a book that synchronizes audio with text, which is very useful for some users. And also whether or not there's a table of contents and other navigational features and so on. Another important element I want to mention is none. We added the term none to the accessibility features list because in the EPUB accessibility conformance document, we wanted to make it mandatory to include metadata about the accessibility of your ebook. But we have to recognize that there could be ebooks that don't have any specific accessibility features available. So we've added the word none. We don't expect it to get a lot of use because most ebooks at the very least have some of these features. They have a table of contents, or they have an index, or they have some navigation. But we did add that so that it's possible to mandate compliance with the metadata. Accessibility hazard I mentioned earlier, it's for warning people about physiologically dangerous situations. And currently that's in use in a smaller number of sites, between 10 and 100 domains. And the vocabulary we have is flashing or no flashing, motion simulation or no motion simulation, and sound or no sound hazard. There are certain kinds of sounds that can trigger seizures for some users. And so this isn't meant to say, is there any audio in this document at all? It's meant to be a warning for particular kinds of sounds that may be harmful. And then in addition there we have unknown, because if you have a resource that's at the beginning of its evaluation process, for example, and you haven't checked yet to see whether there are any hazards, you might still need to be able to put metadata on it. So that's what unknown is for. Accessibility control, as I mentioned, is input methods that are sufficient to fully control the described resource. So some users can only use one input method, and they need to know whether they're going to get halfway through a resource and hit a block, because there's some part of it that needs a different input mechanism. So these are meant to indicate when a resource can be entirely used from a single mechanism. And there can be more than one of it. You can repeat it. A resource could be fully usable from the keyboard as well as from the mouse or from a touch screen and so on. Accessibility APIs is a technical term to indicate resources that are meant to be used on a certain platform and that have accessibility features for that platform. So this wouldn't apply necessarily to HTML, but it might apply to downloadable resources that are designed for Android or for BlackBerry or for iOS. We do have a few web-based things in here. There's Java accessibility and ARIA. Because ARIA is such an important feature for web accessibility, we thought that it would be useful for people to be able to promote when they've used ARIA and hopefully used it accurately to improve their websites. And now looking at the pending resource description properties, we've got access mode, which as I mentioned is the way to describe the basic resource modes. So auditory, tactile, textual, visual. And then we have a bunch of subsets of visual, because sometimes a person has some vision but has a visual impairment that makes it difficult for them to use some materials. For example, if you're colorblind, you're not a screen reader user, but you need to know if there's something in a resource that will be difficult for you to use if you can't distinguish colors. So we have a term called color dependent, meaning that there's information in this resource that is dependent on the user's ability to understand color. And then in a similar vein, we have chart on visual, chem on visual, diagram, math, music, and text on visual. And these are for cases where you've got a picture of a thing that really has information. So it's very common on the web today to see pictures of text. You'll see a place on a website where a developer wanted very highly designed text, and so they used a picture of that text, and there's no real text there that a user can get to. And this causes problems for a few different groups. It's difficult for obviously for people who are using a screen reader, because there's no text there to be grabbed unless there's alt text. But even if there is alt text, it's still difficult to use for a low vision user who might, for example, have set their system up to enlarge alt text or to use a custom color or a custom font. And when you've got a picture of text, you can't change it. It can't be put into that person's custom color or custom font. So that could create, so these are some specific subcases of visual that apply to people with specific visual impairments or specific assistive technology needs. So here's access mode sufficient, and I'll try to talk a little bit about what access mode sufficient is for. It's a little bit complicated. The official definition is a list of single or combined access modes that are sufficient to understand all the intellectual content of a resource. So the goal here is to do a little bit of thinking in advance, so to speak, about what access modes are available in the resource and what accessibility features are available that sort of mitigate those access modes. So for example, if you have a video that has captions in it, that video is accessible by sight alone because the captions provide visual input into the audio stream. So if you had a captioned video, you might say that that resource could be used with a combination of auditory and visual mode, that is someone who's looking and hearing. But you could also say that because it has captions, it can be used by someone who is only looking. So it would also have an access mode sufficient of visual. So it's a list of lists. It's a way of saying, here are different ways that users might choose to approach this resource. And so it's a longer, more complicated technically, and it's something that we think will be most useful for accessibility providers. That is, some publishers may choose to use it, but we probably think the highest usage of this will come from specialized libraries for people with disabilities who have a really deep insight into user needs and want to express in a very specific way how their users will be able to use this material. And one of the reasons that we created this in conjunction with the EPUB community is that there are a lot of ways of making accessible books, and they vary. So for example, you could have an ebook, an accessible ebook that's mostly audio, that is a talking book, and the only text in there is the table of contents because it's used for navigation. Well, if you say that that book has text and audio, you might think that that's useful to somebody who can't hear and wants to look at the book on the screen. But it's not, because it's not the full text of the document. The only sufficient access mode for enjoying that book would be audio. If you can't listen to the audio, you're not going to get the whole book. Similarly, you might have a dictionary that's almost all text, but they've got recordings of the audio for the pronunciation of each word. And then you would want to say that your access mode sufficient to use this book is that you must be able to read textual material. So that we call textual and not visual, because if it's true digital text, it can be read aloud, it can be translated to Braille, and so on. You're not limited to looking at it with your eyes, but it must be true text. Whereas a person who didn't want to read text, only wanted to hear audio, would not benefit from that dictionary because the definitions of the words and the sample sentences and so on are only presented in text and not in audio. So that's a quick run through what access mode sufficient does. And then accessibility summary is the human readable summary that handles the subtle cases such as short descriptions are present, but long descriptions will be needed for non-visual users. You might see that on a textbook, for example, if it's only been prepared for a basic use and hasn't yet been fully converted for use by a blind person. Or you might see a label that says short descriptions are present and no long descriptions are needed. So the person who did the accessibility cataloging might want to communicate that the lack of long descriptions shouldn't deter anyone because there weren't any images in this product that were complex enough to need long descriptions, and so on. You can also use this to handle some language subtleties. There are some use cases in countries where more than one language is common of wanting to express what language each of the different accessibility pieces are in. And that could be done in metadata, but it's a bit more complex. And so the accessibility summary might be a good way for a user to know more about those kinds of details before they bother to download a book. So here's a quick peek at what accessibility metadata looks like in HTML. This is a Bookshare book. I think it's one of those Magic Treehouse books like I showed you in the search that has image descriptions. And the way that you code up accessibility metadata is you put these meta item prop lines in the text. So right in the code of the HTML, you put in the metadata, you list what property you're talking about, like book format or accessibility feature, and then you list the content, like long description or alternative text. And that's it. It just sits in the code where the user doesn't necessarily even see it, and it provides that information. There are ways to mark up visible text on the screen as also being the metadata. So for example, if you've got a visual piece of text on your catalog that says image description, then there are ways to mark that up to actually be the metadata as well as the visual content. So how can this have impact? What can all of us do to improve accessibility for people who need it using these features? So right now, if you are running a specialized library with accessibility for people with disabilities, you can use these metadata properties to give a catalog of the accessibility features of your books, and this should be useful to your members. It might also be useful to non-members. If you're surfacing your resources to be searchable on the broader web, then you might bring in some new members this way by having data exposed about the accessibility features of your books. If you're a general audience publisher, you can use the metadata both to list any accessibility features that you're providing and also to list the basic access modes in your products, because if even if you haven't yet done any accessibility work on a book or another resource, it already is accessible to a lot of people just by virtue of what kind of access modes are in it to start with. And also, as I mentioned earlier, even an unintentionally accessible ebook is likely to have a table of contents or navigation structure. So there'll be some things to say about the accessibility of nearly any ebook. I would like to caution you to be accurate, because if we get a lot of inaccurate metadata up on the web, it probably won't help our cause. People will stop paying any attention to it. And so one of the ways that it seems likely that the metadata would become inaccurate is if organizations are using a lot of cut and paste. So if you've got a whole series of books that are really the same, they offer the same set of accessibility features and they're built with the same set of access modes, then by all means write one really carefully written accessibility statement and copy it to the metadata of all of your books. But beware that there isn't some variation between those books that will make some of that metadata inaccurate. If users start to see every book saying that it has image description, and then a third of the time when they download the book there's no image description, that's going to be disappointing and will make people less trustful of the metadata. Another group who I'd like to appeal to start making efforts now is schools, libraries, other institutions that purchase books. If you are purchasing books, especially digital books, you can start now to ask publishers to provide you with accessibility metadata. So we can put a little bit of incentive on the purchasing side by letting publishers know that this is something that the market values, and we'd like to see more accessibility metadata in the publishers' catalogs so that your institution knows what you're getting when you buy a book, or so that your students can make better choices. And even your faculty might need to choose resources that are accessible for them or resources that are accessible for students who are enrolled in their courses. So if you're a book publisher, a book purchaser or a library, a licensor, please start asking publishers whether they can provide you with accessibility metadata about their books. In the future, what we're hoping to see is a big increase in that number of domains using the accessibility metadata. And one of the reasons for that is it won't start showing up in the mainstream search engines until there's evidence of a lot of use. So schema.org is an industry consortium of Google, Yahoo, Bing, and Yandex, which is a European search engine. And until those mainstream search engines see a lot of sites using the metadata, they're less likely to put it into their mainstream searches the way Google is using its own metadata right now internally in its searches. So when we start to see dozens and dozens of libraries and general purpose sites publishing the metadata, then that's going to increase the chances that the mainstream search engines will start to use it. Until that happens, it's still useful. You can use it internally for your own. For example, you could create a Google custom search for your library or institution's website. And in your Google custom search on your own website, you could provide access to accessibility metadata that you've created in your pages. You can use it internally even if you're not using Google Custom Search. If you're using a different kind of internal search engine or your own database, you can use it there. So having that metadata will be useful to you even if you're not yet able to search it from Google. So it's a great time to get started. And those of us at Diagram and WGBH are available to help. And we hope that we can make it possible for you to start using the schema.org accessibility metadata. This next slide has a list of resources, and you might be able to search up these things just from the search terms that I've given here, or you might need to wait and use the slides and get the link. There's a link to the accessibilitymetadata.org site, which is a11ymetadata.org. The vocabularies themselves for each term, the definitive copy is on the W3C's website at a W3C wiki called Web Schemas. And then the schema.org site itself has links to that web schema. So if you start at schema.org, schema.org, you'll find both the properties and a link to the vocabulary site. And then finally, I wanted to mention a document called schema.org Metadata Integration Guide for EPUB 3. So if you're creating EPUB 3 packages and you're not sure where in the package the schema.org metadata goes, and that goes for general metadata, not just accessibility metadata, you can consult this document, which is available from the IDPF. It's called the schema.org Metadata Integration Guide, and there's a link here for that as well. So I think we've managed to save 12 minutes for questions, which is fantastic. Amaya, do you want to queue up the questions that make the most sense? You're muted if you're trying to.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. I will do that. I've actually been flagging them. We have 6 at the moment. I will also unmute people so that you can go ahead and just ask questions in real time, which I'll do right now. So just give us a second because you'll hear the announcement.
The conference has been unmuted.
So people have to go ahead. And in terms of questions that are in one of the laws
I think the unmuting process is making a little noise as it works.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. So
the conference has been muted.
Oh, I've gone back to muting people. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. There's a little raise your hand icon, and then I can unmute people that way.
And this is Madeline, and I'm back as well. You may be able, I'm not sure if I can unmute myself because I'm a presenter, or if everybody is allowed to unmute themselves when they have a question. So, should I start at the top of the question list?
Yeah, why don't we start at the top of the question list, and then once we've done these, we can jump into the other ones and maybe try the unmuting again, but people can just leave themselves muted unless they have a question.
That'd be great. Peter Rogers asks, what are the laws around this in the US and Europe? Are publishers or others obliged by law to make accessible data and thus metadata? And the answer is that the laws vary widely. I'm not a legal expert, so I may not be giving the most comprehensive view of the law. But in the US, primarily the obligation is on schools and universities to provide accessible education to their students. So the school or university has to find some way to make that student's educational experience accessible. And it's sure a lot easier for them if the publisher provides them with an accessible book. But if the publisher does not provide an accessible book, it's the institution that's on the hook to solve the problem. And so that's led to a situation where we have every university working on making books accessible every term instead of getting them accessible straight from the publisher. That's something that's changing. There's a movement that Benetech leads called Born Accessible, where the goal is to have every digital book come from the publisher fully accessible, and so that's making some progress. But I can't give a definitive statement, and I definitely don't know European law. I apologize. The next question from Rachel Comerford is, Is there a reason that for terms like no flashing hazard and flashing hazard that it can't be assumed that there's no hazard unless it's otherwise identified? Why do we have the vocabulary to say both you do have the hazard and you don't? And that is an excellent question. The reason is that sometimes you want to say that there's a problem here, and sometimes you want to say, I checked this and there isn't a problem here. So it's useful, there are useful statements to be made in both directions. You might want to say, this resource is safe and there's no hazards that we know of. Or you might want to say that there's a hazard here and you need to watch out for it. So that's why we've got both. Rachel's next question is the recommendation for access mode sufficient that publishers not use it unless they're producing highly specialized accessible products? No, I may have overly discouraged people when I spoke about that. The reason that I said that is it's a little bit complicated to understand. And so if you're a mainstream publisher and you've got the expertise in-house to do a thoughtful job of metadata, then absolutely you could go ahead and start providing access mode sufficient metadata. It's just that in our work with it so far, we find that sometimes people find it a little bit difficult to understand. And so it may be a little trickier than some of the other fields to figure out. And Rachel had one more question, which is, for the accessibility summary, will there be recommended language or recommended key points to address? And for now, no, I don't think there is. There might be some that comes out of advocacy groups. For example, somebody might as a project to decide to write a bunch of model accessibility summary language. At the moment, that's not something that I'm aware of that's in progress. Will Awad asked, can the alternative text be added to metadata? And the answer is no. This schema.org metadata is not the place where you type the words that describe the picture. You don't type the alternative text itself. It's a way to indicate that your page has accessibility metadata in it that you've added using the normal HTML. So you'd continue to add your alternative text using HTML alt attributes or long description. And then you would use the metadata to advertise the fact that you had done so. Joshua Talent asked, why is this text in the HTML body, not in the head? And that question is over my head, sorry to make a pun. But schema.org has more information on their website about how to implement schema in general. And so since the accessibility metadata is no different than other parts of schema, I would suggest looking at their general guidance to better understand how to use it. And it may be that it doesn't have to be done the way that it was in the sample that I showed. The other thing that's available on the schema site is examples in different bindings. So you can do accessibility metadata. You can do schema.org metadata in RDF or in microdata or in JSON LD. All of those are possible using the same vocabulary set, and so you should be able to match it to your technical situation. Ted Gies asks, is there a way to capture again how to set the Google custom search engine so we can try it on our end? Sure, I can. Let's see, if I share that screen, I'm going to lose my view of the pictures. Why don't we say that we can share some links on how to do that with the follow-up materials. Robert Oates asks, what exactly is high contrast audio? The idea of high contrast audio, which is one of the accessibility features, is that some audio, for example, if it's a video, a sort of a movie, might have a lot of background noise. It might be hard to hear. And there are some users for whom that would make that movie inaccessible because they normally use hearing, but the quality of the audio is not good enough for them. So there's an emerging concept of high contrast audio, which means audio where the speakers' voices are privileged and any background noise or sound effects are reduced to make it easier for people to hear. Steve Nordmark asks, accessibility metadata has been out there for a few years. Why do you believe there are so few domains leveraging it? Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. I think that accessibility as a whole is a movement that's growing. And so as we reach more people and communicate more about the requirements for accessibility, both legally and as a human endeavor, that we'll see more and more accessibility metadata coming out. And I guess your guess is as good as mine as to why it hasn't yet been picked up. But hopefully events like this one that teach people more about it and how to use it will be helpful in that regard. How are we doing for time? Just 3 more minutes. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 more questions. I'll try to zoom through these if I can. Jacqueline Corexi asks, how often do you plan to release new metadata guidelines? Adding new properties to the metadata doesn't happen very often. So this is just the second time we've done it in a number of years. But adding new vocabulary terms to the existing properties, we don't have a schedule for how often to do it, but certainly we can do it when there's a compelling need. So if a specific advocacy community comes forward and offers some meaningful terms that would benefit everybody or specific groups, then we'll go ahead and add those to the vocabulary. But there isn't a set schedule. Lynn McCormick asks, since YouTube videos automatically create captioning, how does the search differentiate a custom captioning process from the auto captioning process, which normally isn't useful? Well, Lynn, I can definitely agree with you that the auto captioning tends to be dreadful to the point of not at all usable. I don't know if the automatic YouTube metadata includes auto captioning in addition to handwritten captions. So that would be a really useful experiment to poke through that long list of caption videos that comes up and see if there are any that are using the auto captioning feature, because that would indicate that the data was less useful. So far, ones I've checked have always had good quality captions, which makes me think it's only counting them if they were handwritten captions, so to speak. But someone from Google would need to answer that, and they are not generally into speaking publicly about what they do. They like to just go and get it done and let us all figure it out afterwards. If there's anyone from Google here who would like to speak to that, let us know. Lori Riley asks, for book publishers, is the metadata always at the asset level, or could it be at the chapter level, section level, etc.? That is an excellent question. And there's been a lot of work in accessibility metadata over the years to try to think about how to handle the granularity. You can certainly, okay, I'm not an EPUB expert, so I can't definitively speak to how EPUB would handle it. I believe in EPUB the metadata is going in the package, which means it would be at the whole package level. But in other kinds of metadata, for example, if you're using metadata on the web, you can put metadata at lower level spots. For example, on I think you can put it on divs and things like that. So if you're producing HTML materials, yes, you can definitely put the metadata at different levels. And if you're doing it in EPUB, I'm not sure what the right answer is for that. Olav Indergaard asks, is information about DRM protection handled anywhere in the current vocabulary? There is one piece that nods briefly at DRM. We didn't get too deep into DRM because it's a touchy subject, shall we say. But we did add in the accessibility feature vocabulary the term unlocked. You see it here at the end, unlocked. And so that's a way of saying that this document is fully usable, that it doesn't hold any DRM. But what we don't have is more sophisticated DRM metadata like for who or what are the terms and so on. I believe there may be other schema.org fields you can use to point to a right statement. So if you have a detailed right statement somewhere on your website for each book, for example, you might be able to point at that with your schema metadata, but it wouldn't be specifically in accessibility metadata. We're running out of time, but if everyone wants to hold on for another minute, I'll answer the last question and then check that there aren't any more. Willow Watt asks one more question. What is the most important thing about an image in a book? Is it the title or the description or both? I think you're asking if, for example, a photo caption or an image title is a good alternative to a full image description. And the answer is it depends a bit on what the title is, whether the title is fully descriptive of what a user needs to know about that image. There is a whole level of expertise needed to write really good image description. And actually we have free image description guidelines available from the Diagram Center, created through research that my group at WGBH has done. So if you're interested in how to write good image descriptions, please go to the Diagram Center website and look for the image description guidelines. And there's also image description training sessions and webinars similar to this one that I believe are probably archived on the site. And
They are?
And so you can go and check those out and hear one of my colleagues train you in how to write good image description. Were there any more questions that people wanted to raise by audio, or that somebody wants to type in and hasn't finished yet?
So everybody's still muted. I'm hesitant to unmute just from our previous encounter. So if there's any last minute questions, people want to post them in chat, I will make those available.
Oh, you know what? There are some more questions in the chat that didn't get flagged as a question. Let's see. In the chat, Max Handelsman mentioned that YouTube auto captions have to be turned on by the creator. It's been our experience, at least in the past, that they were turned on by default by YouTube, and that the creator needed to go in by hand and automatically and intentionally turn them off. If that's no longer true, I'd be very happy. In the past, that was the case. Oh, Joshua answered the question about where can you put metadata by saying that in EPUB, yes, it's at the package level, but you can put some in each HTML file. Oh, and Svea Sigmund, who's one of my collaborators in the EPUB accessibility work, clarifies that you can put metadata at a very granular level even in EPUB 3.1. So this may be one of the improvements to EPUB that we made. There's a lot of new accessibility features in EPUB 3.1. So if you're producing EPUB and want it to be accessible, you'll definitely want to look at 3.1. Also in the chat, if you're looking at the chat, there's a bunch of terrific links. Amea's posted a link to the Making Images Accessible Image Descriptions Guideline, and Charles has reminded us that there's a POET training module that will kind of walk you through the process of creating image descriptions. And Steve has posted the links to the schema.org properties that you can use to describe digital rights management, which are license and copyright holder. So thank you all for those contributions. It's terrific to have so many good resources available. And thank you all for coming. I hope that you all enjoyed it and learned something.